Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Paul Davies, who's Professor of Physics and Cosmology at Arizona State University. His research interests have focused mainly on quantum gravity, early universe cosmology, the theory of quantum black holes, and the nature of time. He has also made important contributions to the field of astrobiology and was an early advocate of the theory that life on Earth may have originated on Mars. Welcome, Paul.
Yes, it's a delight to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I was reading through your essay, Paul, What is Life? In Search of a Unified Theory of Everything. And I come to you, I have to say, unencumbered by knowledge. So we can take it wherever you think is interesting. So I thought we would start with a definition. So do we have a crisp definition for life yet?
Well, I think the whole purpose of the essay and the book on which it was based is that we don't have a definition of life. And I should say this question, what is life? I'm not the first physicist to ask that. You're probably aware that the most successful scientific theory of all time is called quantum mechanics. It explains the nature of matter all the way from subatomic particles up through materials right up to the nature of stars. And one of the architects of quantum mechanics in the 1920s was Erwin Schrödinger, Austrian theoretical physicist. And Schrödinger thought that this theory brilliantly accounted for the nature of all matter except living matter. And during World War II, he sought sanctuary in Dublin, which was in neutral Ireland at the time, so he wasn't involved in the war effort, but he chose to devote his attention to this question, what is life? Gave a series of lectures in 1943 at Trinity College in Dublin, became a book with that title, and it was very influential in the early stages of what we now call molecular biology. So Crick and Watson, who discovered very famously the double helix structure of DNA, were much influenced by Schrödinger's addressing this question, what is life? Well, fast forward all these years, all these decades, we really still don't have a definition of how living matter and non-living matter differ in a fundamental way. You can list properties of life, but it's always possible to find non-living things with those same properties. So I have a particular take on it. For me, life is not just about complex chemistry. It's about complex chemistry that can run software. It's organized information. So it's matter which organizes information in a way that is very distinctive. So for me, life is all about this elusive thing called information. And I think if we focus on that, if you like, the software of life, not the hardware, then we will find the key And of course, what we want is a definition of life that would work even on other worlds, where the biochemistry may be totally different. So the hardware might be different, but I think there are universal software principles which pick out life as a very exceptional system.
Yeah, I can internalize that, Paul. I know a bit about computers, and it does make a lot of sense. But oftentimes, biologists who come on the show and neuroscientists, neurologists don't like to make an analogy to computers because they believe the human brain is substantially different, which is likely true. But Schrodinger is interesting. After having done all the work in quantum mechanics, this question around life seems to take him in a slightly different direction, right?
I suppose you could say that here was a brilliant physicist who had done incredible work in his 20s, but had the opportunity in later years to indulge these more esoteric interests. This happens with many scientists. And so, of course, it was a departure. But the book he wrote really isn't terribly radical. He's not suggesting anything that shocked the scientific community, but he did leave open the possibility, as he called it, of a new kind of physical law prevailing in it being living matter. And over the years, I don't think very many physicists have taken seriously the idea there might be new physics in life. But I've come around to the point of view that there is, that we can only fully understand life by recognizing that the physics of living matter differs fundamentally from the physics of non-living matter in a way that relates to this information concept. This is really no more than a pious hope at this stage. I haven't written down the equations that couple the information to the matter in a way that says if it does this, it's life. If it does that, it isn't life. Haven't got that far yet. But this whole line of inquiry, I think, is proving very fruitful, and there are many scientists at the intersection of physics, biology, chemistry, computing, and nanotechnology. All those things come together in the micro realm where living organisms are storing, processing, and replicating information. I think we're going to find there is some new physics going on there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big change. Physicists suggesting new physics to explain something outside the domain is a big leap forward.
You're right there. I mean, that's absolutely right. I'd just like to comment on that because you have to avoid what in previous generations was known as vitalism, of saying, well, living organisms are so strange and they differ from other complex systems in such a fundamental way, there must be some extra stuff or ingredient or something that infuses them and brings them alive. And similarly with consciousness, people will say, well, thoughts and feelings and sensations, these things can't be captured by atoms and molecules and just referring to the forces between them. We need something extra. But in science, it's always a dangerous thing to sort of paste on some additional physical entity. So I'm not suggesting there's any sort of nebulous stuff inside living, let alone thinking matter, but that the laws of physics, as we currently understand them, are simply inadequate to encompass the types of features that I've been talking about involving information processing and what we often call top-down causation, the ability for the system as a whole to have causative efficacy, to use a cumbersome term, to actually have clout when it comes down to the microscopic level. We tend to think of everything the other way, that if you understand the components, you understand the whole system. But it's very clear living organisms have feedback loops in which the organism as a whole feeds back into the microscopic activity. And expressing that mathematically and trying to capture that with traditional laws of physics is impossible. We need a new mathematical framework for it.
Yeah, so from a definitional perspective, one thing that, without knowing anything about it, one thing that I can understand is that there appears to be an objective function, there appears to be a goal for life. The objective functions appears, at least, Paul, it seems pretty simplistic. Sustenance and replication, there aren't too many factors, it looks like, in the objective function, but it appears that they have a goal to satisfy.
I think there's no doubt that living organisms seem to operate as if there is an agenda, a goal or purposes. Obviously, that's true of human beings, but you only have to look at a dog, sniffing for a bone or something like that, or even a humble bacterium working its way up a chemical gradient towards a food source. To recognize this is one of the fundamental features of living matter. Now, in biology, goals or destinations, or to use the philosophical term, teleology, has something of a bad press, but it arises in two completely different contexts. One of these is the individual organism working towards something, having some internal algorithm or agenda that programs it to do this or that in order to gain some advantage. And so it's from the mathematical point of view, it's an optimization problem. Organisms take in information, they garner information from their environment, they process it internally, they devise a strategy, and then they act according to that. Plants do it as well. It's not just animals or bacteria. But then there's the other, the great sweep of biological evolution over billions of years. And that's where it was always very contentious, because Darwin famously said, well, I'm not sure he was the one to put it in these words, but nature cannot look ahead. All that happens is that at the time, if there are slight variations, some variants will be favored over others and will go on to replicate their favorable traits. And so it's a very simple idea, as opposed to the work of the French biologist Lamarck, who suggested that if organisms strive in their lifetime to achieve certain goals, that this will change the nature of their offspring to make it easier for them to achieve those goals. So the giraffe straining its neck to reach the high branches will give rise to longer-necked progeny. That's pretty thoroughly knocked on the head in the manner I've described it. So the idea that somehow there's a blueprint or roadmap for the great evolutionary venture with some particular destination, like intelligent beings, is really frowned upon by most biologists. But there's a caveat to what I've just said, which is that there's a shadow of Lamarckism still alive in biology, in as much as there is the ability of organisms, it's not so prominent in human beings, but certainly some other organisms can transmit information into the germline, so their progeny acquire characteristics which are colored in some way by the experiences of the parents and grandparents and so on. This has been pretty thoroughly demonstrated. It's often called epigenetic inheritance, intergenerational epigenetic inheritance, another mouthful. But the evidence for that now is overwhelming. So this simple original Darwinian picture of it's just all random and there's no destination is really not quite true. It's much more subtle.
Yeah, so I want to push the idea of goals a little bit further, Paul. So we understand goals from kind of a human-centric perspective, but couldn't we say that Earth has a goal of going around the sun in 365 days? Isn't that a goal?
It's interesting you should raise that, because there's a way of formulating the laws of mechanics in which you would cast it in precisely those terms. So when Newton wrote down the equations for how planets move, it's you solve those equations, you find their trajectories, and it's often called an initial value problem. If you know where the planet is today and how it's moving, you can work out where it's going to be next week, and all that is pretty standard stuff. But about 100 years later, the laws of mechanics got reformulated in a rather different way, where you fix the initial and the final state, and then you look for the path that connects them. And so, although it would be wrong to say the Earth is, looking to be back where it was in a year's time, that's not really true. There's a type of way you can regard it like that. We still use the term water seeks its own level, or the bottom level, or something like that, as if it's got a mind of its own. Doesn't have a mind of its own, but there is a way you can set up the laws of mechanics that is more favorable to that way of thinking. But I think what the reason that a living organism like a bacterium moving towards a goal is different from the Earth moving around the sun is precisely because what I mentioned earlier, that the bacterium is processing information. It's got inbuilt algorithms that takes that sensory input data, processes it, and then responds accordingly. And so the Earth doesn't sort of sniff out its way around the sun, but bacteria will do exactly that. So it's the information that counts.
Yeah, so for an external observer, therefore, is it predictability that differentiates? So, for example, if I just look at the system, I can say I can predict where the Earth is going to be. I cannot necessarily predict, at least deterministically, what the bacterium is going to do. So, is it
Right.
the predictability that differentiates life from non-life systems?
It's an answer yes and no. So many years ago, I wrote about if you throw a dead bird into the air, you can work out where it's going to land. It's very predictable. You throw a live bird into the air, and you have no idea where it's going to come down. And so that's part of it. But we do, of course, know that there are non-living complex systems that are, in practice, unpredictable. These so-called chaotic systems. Just think of a roulette wheel or a coin toss or the path of a hurricane. Many, many examples where the sensitivity to initial conditions is so great that unless you had infinite precision, for all practical purposes, you can't figure out what they're going to do, their future trajectory, or it might be very limited in time. And so these types of systems, these chaotic systems, are very familiar in science. They're all over the place. The Earth going around the sun is not one of them. But there are many, many others. And so predictability is only part of it, I think.
It's only part of it. So are the goals then self-generated? I'm trying to get to, do we have, so suppose, we have X and Y. What are the tests that we could utilize that give us a very high confidence that X is life and Y is not?
That's an interesting way of expressing it. I don't have a ready answer. I'm thinking that, you see, there are lots of experiments with entities that seem to be lifelike but are not living. There's one particular one that my university is investigating, and they're called Xenobots. And these are where cells are harvested from, I think, a frog, and they form little clumps. They look like cells, but they're not. But they have some sort of lifelike behavior and some things that aren't. And it's your suggestion that we might be able to agree on an experimental protocol that would separate out just a very elaborate type of xenobot from a real living thing is an interesting one. If we want to go a little bit up in the scale of investigation, then another group of colleagues of mine here at Arizona State University like to work with ants. And ants are interesting because they engage in collective decision-making for their goals. So it's not like there's a sort of chief ant that decides this place is getting overcrowded. We're going to move to a bigger nest, and I'll go and find it. It doesn't work that way. The ants are scurrying around. They communicate in complicated ways with each other, and they arrive at decisions. No one ant says, right, that's it, I'm in charge, we're all doing this. They somehow collectively arrive at those decisions. And the experiments that my colleagues do, these ants might have a trail towards food, for example, and then they'll put an obstacle in the way and see, well, how do the ants figure out what to do? And then they'll trick them in some other way. And so there's a lot of this type of experimentation where these clever little ants seem to figure out what to do. And so it would be interesting to have at a somewhat lower level something that would identify where a goal is being attained because of some internal information processing going on. I keep coming back to that. They will have an algorithm. And I think it would be true of plants as well. My wife and I have just been spending a lot of time in our garden here because we were away in Australia for a year, and when we came back, things looked a bit of a mess. And in particular, there have been storms, and trees have blown down, and plants looked like they need a lot of attention. And so you come along, and then you prune a bush, oleander, say, or bougainvillea, or something like that. You prune it to make it sort of look nice. And then I thought, well, how does the plant respond to this? And we've removed the tree that crashed down over it, so does it think, well, the tree's now gone, so I can grow in that direction because it's more light. But on the other hand, this has been snipped off, and so I better give my priority to regrowing there, and my roots have all shifted. So, plants will have some sort of internal way of weighing up these different demands on their resources and deploying appropriately. So I think we see it in plants, we see it in animals, we see it even in single-celled organisms, and it's that information processing which is the key.
Yeah, so I want to go there. Before I do that, so but I want to ask you one thing. So we know that the ant is clearly alive. Is the ant colony alive? Like an individual inside a company is alive? Company alive?
Yes. Yes, I would say that we should think of the colony as a superorganism. I'm not the person to coin that term. I think it was E.O. Wilson, because individual ants sort of come and go and live and die, but the colony has a life cycle of its own. And so there is a sense, I think, in which we would think of the colony as a type of organism. And people often say, well, does that mean, the World Wide Web or something like that? We should think of that as alive or conscious, or as the sort of collective activity of many, many humans. And I think that's not a good analogy for the simple reason that the information processing, as I've already stressed, with ants does take place collectively like that, whereas human beings are very powerful examples of decision-making in a solitary manner. I mean, we may consult other people, or we may go to committees and vote on something, but everyone makes up their own mind individually. I don't think ants do that.
Yeah, so I want that might be we're going a little bit on a tangent here, but I want to get your perspective on that. I wondered if that is specific. So we can see communities in let's say Brazil or India or someplace like that who is going to behave very differently from our expectation of Western communities or Western culture.
Yes.
Right. So
correct.
So is it just a sort of a semantic issue?
No, I think at the level of individuals, what I've said is correct. But of course, we mustn't forget the social structure and the social norms and the way that individuals feel they're part of a collective and the way in which they're rewarded. So yet another one of my ASU colleagues studies the Maasai people in East Africa, and their notion of ownership and helping and so on is quite different from the sort of the Western model. It's basically if there's something you need, you take it, and if there's something you can provide, you make it available, and it's not done on a basis of, well, that's mine and you better pay me for it. So it's a completely different reward structure. But I think at the more sort of basic level, what would an individual think? I'm sure somebody thinks, well, I need a bicycle rather urgently, and I know there's one in that hut over there. I'm going to go and take it. I don't think that is anything that's arrived at, in some sort of collective manner. But the system as a whole is, of course, a property of the collective. So humans are really rather outliers in this respect. I think it's always very hard to look at these general principles of biology and then say, well, can we apply those to humans? Because so many of the things we do are either unique or unusual among living organisms. For example, I don't know of any other organisms that really seriously have a sense of humor. It's so that these things are, of course, for me, what's dear to my heart, we're the only organisms who try to understand the world through science and abstract reasoning, and not just observe the world and optimize their behavior, but try to come to understand it, how it actually works.
So let's go into the physics a bit, Paul. So I really subscribe to your ideas that the software of life is fundamental. And if anybody watching a baby grow up, you can see a system that came up with some operating system, basic operating system, and you start putting all sorts of applications on it, and out comes a human being who has all sorts of ideas. That is life, and that's happening not only to humans, to every other biological entity, I would imagine, right?
Yes.
And so you make this distinction between hardware and software. A lot of the work has been done on asking, how do basic dumb chemicals, come together to make the hardware of life? If I understand you correctly, that is sort of a less interesting question than how did life get its operating system and its software.
Correct. That's exactly. I've been interested for over a century in how to make life from scratch, if you like, cooking up life in a test tube lab. And this has been dominated by chemists who have focused on the fundamental building blocks of which life is made, things like amino acids and sugars and so on. And they haven't got very far down that path, but there is a perception that understanding how life emerged has to do with getting the right sequence of chemical reactions. And I think that is only most half the story. I think it's the lesser part of the story. It's a little bit like if you have a computer and you're dazzled by the properties. Take something like PowerPoint. You think, well, that's amazing. All these shapes moving around on the screen, does all these things. How does it work? And if you go to a university and say, explain PowerPoint to me, and they send you to the computer science department and they take out a screwdriver and start taking the back off the computer and they say, well, there's some silicon in here and some copper and it's all a bit complicated, but we think we're getting close to understanding what's going on. If we just had a bigger research budget, we could do it. You were being tricked, because what you've got to do is go and talk to a software engineer who can write code. And the secret of PowerPoint, and what makes it PowerPoint and not Word or Photoshop or something, is the software, it's the code. Yeah. And life is the same thing. It's not good enough to just have a whole lot of building blocks together. Somehow these molecules cooked up the code book of life. And code is the right term because the information in DNA is encrypted, and it's only functional if it's decrypted by a molecular system. And this notion of encrypted, stored, and processed information is something that we associate with human activity, but how on earth did it happen from a mishmash of chemicals? How did molecules write code so that their activity could be organized around informational principles? I think it's a very, very deep history. The origin of this genetic code, which all life on Earth, by the way, has the same coding assignments between the 4-letter alphabet of DNA and the 20-letter alphabet of amino acids which make proteins. They all have the same code. Why that code, where it came from, nobody really knows. I think that is the essence of trying to understand life's origin, is how did the code come into existence?
Yeah, so let me push on that a little bit, Paul. So you cannot install PowerPoint unless you have a computer.
Right.
And so,
Yes.
so aren't they sort of equally important? I mean, in some sense, one could argue that unless you have the hardware sequence figured out, there is no point thinking about the software, because without the hardware, you cannot really install the software.
Right. Of course, it's the classic chicken and egg problem, and it's been recognized by biologists for decades that you can't really have the one without the other. And surely they both didn't pop into existence ready-made. And so there's all sorts of attempts trying to figure out how this transition was made. But the reason I think that the software is more important is because you see, you can change the hardware. So these days it's easier. It was harder in the past. So like many couples, I'm sure out there, one has a Mac and the other has a PC, and they each grumble about the other one, and why don't you get this computer? And so we're in that situation. But if I want to run a PowerPoint presentation, I can take it to my wife's Mac, and it'll run pretty much okay on that. And so it can't run with no hardware, but it can be different hardware. And so that's, if you're interested, like I am, in whether there's life beyond Earth, this is the field of astrobiology, then, of course, what you want to know is, what are the universal principles? In other words, is there some sort of software that can run on the alien hardware and still give you the same sort of basic characteristics? So I think that's the really key point. And for me, that, of course, the hardware is important, because that's still got to be put together somehow. We don't really know how that happened, but I think it's focusing in a way on the lesser problem.
Yeah, so that is really interesting. So let's talk about astrobiology a little bit. So are you saying, Paul, I don't know if I quite understand it, are you saying that the hardware is sort of a standardizable problem? It is a problem of physics. Chemicals came together, created something that looked interesting, but it's not alive unless you load the operating system and the apps on it.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So from an astrobiology perspective, you could take a Earth-based system, and you could potentially reprogram it to be extraterrestrial outside the Earth.
Right. I think you've hit the nail on the head here, because this idea that, the hardware isn't alive unless it's got appropriate software. If you take a bacterium and replace its DNA with just junk DNA, that is an arbitrary sequence, it's not going to do anything. So it will effectively be dead. But if you've got an appropriate sequence for it to be functional, the organism to be functional, away you go. And we know now we can redesign organisms. There's a particular technology called Crispr, which was the subject of the Nobel Prize last year for Jennifer Doudna, one of the inventors of that. And CRISPR means we can rewrite the code book of life. You can take doesn't have to be a bacterium. It can be a human being. You can go in and you can rearrange the letters or the words or the instructions to order. Now, of course, if you just do that randomly, there's an overwhelming chance that you'll have a non-functional organism. But if you do it with some foresight and planning, then sure, you can engineer an organism. In principle, you could engineer a bacterium to live on Mars under its present conditions. There may be bacteria on Mars still clinging on to life in some way, but if what you wanted to do was like terraform Mars or use it as a biology experiment, I'm sure we could improve on existing terrestrial organisms. But of course, it's still using the same fundamental biochemistry. The next step would be, well, you could do biochemistry differently. You might have different nucleotides, different letters of the DNA alphabet. You might have different amino acids to make the proteins. I have friends and colleagues who do that sort of thing in the lab. You can do that. You can make additions and deletions and actually change the fundamental biochemistry, not just the letters, not just the code as it's spelled out, but the actual components of the code itself. And then you could go on beyond that and you could say, well, what about life based on not just different code, different letters, but a different chain of chemical reactions altogether, maybe not even needing liquid water. And so all this sort of speculation's been out there for quite a long while, because when astrobiologists think, could there be life on Titan or Enceladus or, a water world or a world without water, they're thinking of all these possibilities. Yeah. At the moment, there's a theoretical exercise. Nobody has built an organism that can live without liquid water, but we can imagine the sort of... So if the name of the game is the software, the appropriate software arrangement, and that the hardware in which it's instantiated, that you run it on, could be different, I could imagine in the future, when we get a bit smarter about doing these things, that a planet could be discovered with certain features, and then you could have like a designer microbe that could be made to live there. All that is possible, I think.
So it appears that there are sort of two puzzles, right? So just an approximate timeline, the universe, 13.75 years, solar system, 4.5 billion, and the Earth, approximately that. And life evolved on Earth, or started on Earth, I should say, very, very quickly, maybe 4 to 3.5 billion. So do we have two puzzles? Do we have sort of a hardware puzzle and a software puzzle? Did they happen together? Could there have been a time gap between the two?
Well, you're absolutely right that life did get going on Earth pretty much as soon as conditions settled down. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, but it was a rather horrible place for a while, because there were so many asteroids and comets slamming into it, and some of these impacts might have been big enough to boil the oceans and sterilize the whole planet. So it's long been a bit of a mystery as to why things got going quickly. And there are a number of different explanations. One of these is that, well, maybe life came from somewhere else. Because remember, 4.5 billion years sounds a long time to you and me, but as you pointed out, the universe is over 13 billion years old. So there were stars and planets around long before Earth even existed. And if life can get going fairly readily, then it could certainly get splashed around, because these impacts I've just been mentioning can eject rocks carrying microbes into space, and then they can fall on other bodies as well. And so it's not impossible that life came to our solar system from somewhere else, and Earth was sort of freshly minted and settled down and was sort of ready for life, could host life, and it obligingly dropped in the form of a meteorite. And this bombardment of meteorites, this isn't a fortuitous thing. We know it's enormous number of extraterrestrial rocks hitting the Earth all the time. So So it's a very natural mechanism, but of course, only putting off the evil day, you've still got to say, well, how did life get going on that other place? And did that require a coincidence of the hardware and software? And we really don't know. I should say that there is another explanation. It's a sort of quirky one, but I think the logic is sound as to why life got going very quickly. And that's it's a selection effect. We're here on Earth talking about this because life did get going quickly. And when you look back, you see the Earth doesn't have an unlimited amount of time to wait for life to arise. It's the window of habitability is probably only about 4 billion years. Mm-hmm. So unless life had got going pretty fast at the beginning, it wouldn't have evolved to the point of intelligence by the time that window closed. So it could be an extremely rare dream run of events that has led to this, us being here within this window, which necessitated life getting started very early. That's a philosophical and a mathematical argument, not a chemistry or biology, but I think it has some force. And if we imagine that life is extremely rare in the universe, and there are very, very few planets that have it, it may be that those planets that do have it, it has to get off to a quick start in order to have it at this particular epoch of the universe.
Yeah, so in this hardware-software context, Paul, is it possible that, sort of the hardware happened, it was waiting for the operating system to get installed for a while?
I don't think so, for the simple reason that, first of all, the hardware, we've been sort of just using that term, is incredibly complex. Yeah. So when you look at even the simplest bacterium, the specialized molecules and the total number of them is staggering. Often give the analogy, it's like saying, oh, well, we finally figured out how to make a brick, so New York City will just be more of the same. There's no problem. It's how the whole thing is assembled. But it's worse than that because, of course, we just got one of these things. It's not going to do anything. And if it's going to replicate, it can only replicate by having the software program for replication. It's got to be, the architecture for this was worked out by John von Neumann many decades ago, self-replicating machine, if you think of life as being that. It's got to have a program to run the replication process, and then it's got to make a replica of the program itself. So all of that, has to be there. And so I don't think it's a matter of, well, we'll figure out a way of doing the complex chemistry and there'll be all these cells lying around just waiting for some software to drop in from space. I think that's not going to work.
Yeah. Philosophically, that makes it more difficult in some sense because the problem remains to be sort of a higher complex problem that a bunch of chemicals got together, they started computing, and they have a goal, and they pursue those goals. It just seems too abstract in some ways, right?
Yes. Well, I think it's a very, very profound problem, and I'm not the only one to think that. We don't have the answer. And through most of my career, I thought, well, that's just because we lack the technical detail to fill in the gaps, to join the dots between just a mishmash of organic molecules and a living thing. But I've come around to the point of view that Schrödinger himself left open as a possibility, that not just that there's a new kind of physics operating in living matter, but a new kind of physical law. That this isn't something which is just some, different branch of physics. There's some new kind of law, not just new law, new kind of law. And I think it's this kind of law that I've been talking about, which involves the hardware and the software coupled together in a way. There will be, like all laws, there'll be some equations to describe how this happens. It'll be something that emerges at a certain level of complexity, but it will lead to genuinely new physical effects and physical phenomena. This is for the future. I think we've made enormous progress in understanding the molecular basis of life, the reductionist program of breaking it down to its components, and that's very exciting. But the synthesis of putting it all together into a whole with the feedback loops from the whole to the parts, that's something that the physicists in particular really struggle to put that together. The difficulty is that theoretical physics is so guided by mathematics that what we ideally want, you see a phenomenon, you write down an equation that seems to describe it, you solve the equation, you make predictions. That time-honored procedure doesn't really work very well in biology, where the wholes and the parts get entangled together in a very difficult way, and the standard type of differential equations really don't seem to work very well.
Yeah, I sometimes felt, Paul, that the cognitive cost of reductionism is a lot lower than synthesis. So that's why we get a lot more engineers, doctors, and physicists, but fewer literature and music graduates, right? The cognitive cost is a lot higher when you try to synthesize.
Yeah, yes, there's no doubt that you get more bang for your buck. It's a great way to begin a research program. How does this system work? Well, it's smash it to bits and see what it's made of. And you get quite a long way like that. But of course, if what you're looking at is a system, it's the whole thing, then it becomes really baffling, because we know with living organisms, if you look at their atoms, they just do what atoms got to do. There's nothing special about a carbon atom in an organism from a carbon atom floating in the air. It's carbon dioxide. It's got the same physical properties, but you get nowhere in trying to understand life by studying individual carbon atoms. It's the collective that is the important thing.
Yeah. We'll do a quick break, Paul. When we come back, we'll talk more about life.
All right.
Are you okay to go another 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay,
all right. I'll log off this and then wait for your message.
I'll send you another link. Yeah.
All right.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we are back, Paul. We're talking about life. What the definition of life, how it might have started. We still don't have a lot of knowledge around that. In the essay that we were talking about, you say, in truth, standard physics and chemistry have spectacularly failed to explain life's origin. So we are still at that point, right? We haven't really gone a lot further.
Well, I'm afraid that's true. That's not to denigrate the heroic efforts of a group of scientists called biophysicists. So these are physicists who will study the components of life. Might be just individual molecules, might be some more complicated thing like a little pump or devices that walk along fibers and carry cargo and so on. And they'll study these things and try to understand them in terms of basic principles of force and energy and entropy and things like that. And that's all fine. But of course, that's not really helping understand the essence of what life is really about, which, as we've been discussing, is really more to do with the system as a whole and with the way it uses information to manage its affairs. We don't have that so well understood within the scope of traditional physics, but there is a clue, and it comes from the physics of the mid-19th century and the work in particular of James Clerk Maxwell, who was one of the founders of the subject known as thermodynamics. That's a subject that looks at the nature of heat, all the molecules rushing around, looks at the efficiency of heat engines, when can you extract work from heat and what are the limits to that. All that was worked out in the mid-19th century. And Maxwell came up with a very curious idea. He imagined a box of gas with a partition down the middle, a screen, with a little hole in it. If you set that up, then of course from time to time a molecule will pass through the hole from left to right or from right to left, and it sort of averages out over time. But then he imagined a little being that came to be known as a demon, a Maxwell's demon, sitting near the hole with a shutter mechanism, and then could block the passage of the molecule if it was, for example, moving very fast, but not if it was moving more slowly. And by doing that repeatedly, it would be possible to build up a temperature gradient. You'd have hotter gas on one side, molecules moving faster than on the other side, and then any competent engineer could design a device to run off that temperature difference and do some useful work. So it looked like that Maxwell had come up with some sort of perpetual motion machine that operated on the basis of information. That is, that the demon would gather information about the molecules approaching the hole, process that information internally, and then operate the shutter accordingly. And all of those maneuvers could be done in principle with no energy expenditure. So here was a method, it appeared, of converting information into work. And it was just a thought experiment at the time, but now nanotechnology has reached the point where real Maxwell demons can be manufactured. This works, this is true. Maxwell demons are out there, they use information as a type of fuel. And just read a paper yesterday about a new way of doing this with quantum information. And so the idea that information has a real physical effect and is like a type of fuel has now become pretty much accepted. So here we see a link between traditional physics of concepts like energy and work and information, which seems to come from a different branch of inquiry altogether. But they are linked, and that link has been known since the middle of the 19th century. So that is a little chink. It's no more than that, because biological information is a much more elaborate type of thing. It's not just sorting molecules. That does happen too. Living organisms do sort molecules. There are nanomachines in our own bodies chuntering away, playing the margins of the second law of thermodynamics and gaining an advantage by using that little demon trick. But life is much more than about operating efficiently in terms of energy resources. It's about organization and management, and applying or understanding the laws of information management as they apply to physical matter is something that is still beyond our understanding. But we do know that information is physical. It can exert physical effects, and we just need to understand how, in a more elaborate way, that happens in living organisms.
Yeah, so information as fuel has a lot of implications, right? Including astrobiology. So I want to go in that direction a little bit, Paul. So, we've been finding all these extrasolar planets. I think we found like 5,000 of them last 10, 15, 20 years. Many of them are Earth-like planets. They have rocks, rocky planets, rocky surfaces. This might have been a dream for physicists maybe 30 years ago, and find them all over the place. But we haven't found any extraterrestrials yet. There is this idea of Fermi paradox. Enrico Fermi asking, where is everybody? If they are so prevalent in the universe, we haven't found anything. So what's our sort of the latest thinking around this?
You're quite right that there is currently no evidence for any life beyond Earth whatsoever, let alone intelligent life. But there's a lot of activity. The subject of astrobiology is precisely dedicated to finding examples of life beyond Earth. And the subset of that subject called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has been going about 70 years, and I've been closely involved with both of these. The latest thinking, let's just jump to SETI for a moment. How might we detect the existence of non-human intelligence? It really amounts to non-human technology. What would be a technological footprint or imprint or signature out there in the universe that would make us sit up and pay attention? For about 50 years, this was pretty much restricted to radio messages. So the SETI astronomers have been sweeping the skies with their radio telescopes, hoping to just stumble across a message from ET. It's a sort of forlorn quest. There's a lot of stars out there. You don't know where to point the telescope. You have no idea whether anyone's transmitting, or are they transmitting deliberately to us. And really, you could go on for a very long time, not find anything, and indeed nothing has been found. But a broader strategy is say, let's not worry about messages. Let's just look to see if there's any alien technology. And one line of investigation into these so-called techno signatures is to say, well, in the past 1,000 years, human beings have modified the surface of our planet through agriculture and then technology. And so we've had a big impact. Global warming is the obvious one, a big impact on our terrestrial environment. Maybe in 1 million years, our technology would get to the point where we could have a big impact on our astronomical environment. Maybe our whole planetary system would show the marks of technological progress or design. And so would an advanced civilization somewhere else have these techno signatures, mega structures or something other than just radio that might show up in a careful survey? And there have been a few suggestions along those lines, one of these being due to Freeman Dyson, that it could be that an energy-hungry civilization might try to trap all of the energy emerging from its star and harness that, and that would show up in a distinctive way in the color temperature of the star and so on. So all of these ideas have been thought. The one that I've been mostly involved with over the past 10 years or so is the possibility of alien technology in the solar system. Because for something to show up many, many light years away, it has to be truly enormous. But if there was an alien probe in the solar system, it might be a rather modest size. So it would be easy to imagine that some advanced civilization had sent probes here. The big problem there is the duration of time. Such probes might have come any time in the 4.5 billion year lifetime of Earth. There's no particular reason they should be coming now. And if there were probes here in the past, maybe they've long since functioned. These are defunct probes. How would we find them? Where might we look? And there's all sorts of suggestions about where we might look. There are conferences on this all the time. I'm closely involved in coming up with ideas. Of course, it's a huge needle in a haystack without any guarantee there's a needle there at all. And so the latest thinking, I think as you asked, is that maybe we should concern ourselves less with possible radio messages and more with looking for nearby techno signatures. When it comes to the broader question of is there life beyond Earth, say bacterial life, that's a different set of issues. And so there's still some hope that within the solar system, we may find simple life, bacterial life. Mars is my favorite. Recently, there was a flurry of interest. Could there be life in the clouds of Venus? And then a lot of people like the icy moons of the outer solar system, like Europa and Enceladus. These are covered in ice and icy crust, but with liquid underneath. Might there be life there? So all of these things are possibilities. There's a big problem with the solar system, and I discussed it earlier, that there's impacts by asteroids and comets that splatter rocks all around the solar system. Yeah. And these rocks can convey terrestrial microorganisms to Mars, for example, or vice versa. So it could be that there is life on Mars. We'll go there, we'll find there is life there, but it's just borrowing old terrestrial life. It's got there from here. It doesn't mean it's a second genesis. It doesn't mean life has started from scratch on Mars as well as on Earth, which is what we'd really like to know. We'd like to know, is the universe intrinsically bio-friendly? Will it bring life into existence against the raw odds once conditions permit? Or is life on Earth just a fluke, just a result of a dream run of particular chemical reactions? We don't know the answer to that. Yeah. And once you go beyond the solar system, well, then we're outside of the range of where we can send space probes. Then it becomes very hard, because how would you know if there's life on one of these extrasolar planets you mentioned a little earlier? What would be a signature of such life? Some people say, oh, oxygen in the atmosphere would be a giveaway, there must be plants. But no, it turns out that there's other ways of getting oxygen. And so if it's not intelligent life, if it's just something pretty simple, then finding that signature, that biosignature from Earth is a big challenge. So lots of thought being given to this, many conferences, many books written, many discussions, but really we're just as much in the dark about it as we were 50 years ago.
Yeah. It seems to me, Paul, there are two fundamental issues. One is this harsh constraint that Einstein gave us, that you cannot travel faster than the speed of light.
Yeah, that's very sad.
It's really sad. And the other issue is we don't have a good understanding how to multiply zero with infinity.
No.
So you can pretty much make up anything that you want there. And so as you described in your books and elsewhere, that till we can find life 2.0, it is going to be our speculation. I mean, anybody can say anything they want. But till then, there isn't really any statistical or mathematical way for us to put some odds on this, right?
That's right. I'm always being asked in interviews, well, what are the chances we're going to find life in my lifetime, something of that sort. And I say, well, the question simply, it infuriates me because it clearly cannot be answered. There's something called the Drake equation. This is due to Frank Drake, who pioneered the whole subject of SETI. And he wrote down all the factors that you would need to know to work out how many civilizations there might be in the galaxy. And the first few factors we do know quite well. It's like the rate of star formation and the number of planets with stars and so on. We know we can measure those things. But then we hit the one that's a really big unknown, which is, given an Earth-like planet, what are the chances that life will emerge on it? And that one we haven't a clue, because we don't know how non-life turned into life. And people say, oh, well, come up with an estimate. Well, you can't estimate the probability of an unknown process. If you tell me what the process was, I can have a go at working it out. But if you don't even know what it is that you're trying to estimate, you're completely stuck. And then after, once life gets going, of course, there are issues. What are the chances that microbial life will eventually evolve into intelligent life? We don't know how to work that out either, but at least we understand the process. It's called Darwinian evolution. Yeah. We know, and so in principle, you could have a go at trying to calculate that, but you can't possibly calculate going from non-life to life because we don't know what did it. And so we're absolutely stuck. It could be that there is only one planet in the entire universe with life on it, and we are it. It would be no surprise that we find ourselves on that planet and not on another one. I mean, it's by definition, we are it. It's equally possible, or at least a lot of my colleagues think this might be the case, that the universe is teeming with life. It's all over the place. But that would only be true if there is some sort of life principle at work in the universe, something to coax matter into life against the raw odds of just shuffling the molecules. You wait forever to just shuffle molecules. If there is such a principle, and there may be, because I was hinting earlier that there's new physics in living matter. There may be a principle of that nature, but we haven't found it yet. And until we do find it, it's impossible to work out. Even if you imagine the experiment of life, all life on Earth being wiped out, what are the chances in another million years or 10 million years it would start up again? We have no idea how to work that out. But if there was a life principle that we understood well enough, you could have a go at estimating that. And then we could get an answer to your question, what are the chances of life somewhere else in the galaxy?
Yeah. I always felt, Paul, that if we come up with a chemistry or biology explanation to life, it's going to be very difficult to extend it outside our system. So ultimately, we need a physics explanation to life. And
Yes.
I always felt that, some sort of thing like, there is an inherent built-in requirement for accelerator entropy. Then life is probably the best thing we know that accelerates entropy. And so if something like that exists, then you have sort of a physics explanation, then we can possibly speculate that there should be life out there.
Yes, and so that's my dream, that we'll unify physics and biology by finding the principles that apply to this new kind of physical law, as Schrödinger expressed it, that is operating in living matter and somehow joins living matter and non-living matter. And that pathway between the two, you would have a way of understanding what it takes to traverse that pathway and what the probability of a system making that transition would be. We don't have that yet, but here is a challenge to anyone listening to me now, any young people who are thinking of a career in science.
Yeah.
What should they do? Should it be in physics, which has had such a fantastic few centuries of success? Could it be in biology, which is an emerging discipline but doesn't have quite that level of success of physics? I would say it would be in the interface of the two, a place where physics and chemistry and biology and computing and information theory and nanotechnology, where they all converge. I think it's at the interfaces of those disciplines we're going to see the exciting developments in the coming decades.
Exciting development. And anybody listening to this and going through school now, I think, Paul, I don't know a lot about this, but I think next 20 years potentially are going to be more interesting than the last.
Sorry, I just had an interrupt. I'm going to have to go in just a second because this person's just arrived. Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
No, I was just saying, for anybody listening, the next 20 years from a sort of a discovery development perspective are going to be more interesting than the last 20. It seems like we have been sort of stagnant in some ways last 20 years.
As I explained earlier, by profession, I'm a theoretical physicist. And so the last 20 years have seen some extraordinary excitement in the area of fundamental physics, because we've seen the discovery of the Higgs boson, which was the missing piece of the jigsaw that unifies the weak and electromagnetic interactions. So that's been predicted since the 1960s, finally found a few years ago. And then the discovery of gravitational waves, which Einstein predicted over 100 years ago. And throughout my career, I've known the people who dedicated their lives to searching for these gravitational waves, trying to build detectors, and finally they have been detected. So physics is not a done deal yet. It's still got a way to run, but it does depend, in both of the cases I gave you, on very expensive, large-scale technology. These machines that detected the Higgs boson, the gravitational waves, are huge, and they require vast teams of individuals to operate them. But if you want to have more modest resources and get more bang for your buck, then it would be in the areas that we've been discussing today.
Yeah, excellent. Paul, thanks so much for spending time with me. This has been great.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for inviting me.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.